For 3 years, Helen McBride, owner of McBride's Diner, knew Frank Donovan as the quiet man at Booth 7, always ordering the same meal and leaving an extra $1.50. Despite his reserved nature, Helen found comfort in his consistent presence. Then, Frank simply didn't show up. Days turned into a week of silent worry for Helen. On Memorial Day, an unexpected sight shattered the diner's calm. 6 Marines in dress blues entered, carrying a folded American flag in a mysterious box. They asked for Helen, revealing they were there on behalf of Frank Donovan. What profound legacy did the quiet man leave for Helen, and why? If Frank and Helen's story touched your heart, imagine the quiet heroes among us. Help us share more inspiring narratives of kindness and dignity. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of what truly matters, and subscribe to our channel. Join our community in honoring these untold stories. For 3 years, he arrived just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, settling into Booth 7 with a stillness that seemed to anchor the entire diner. He was a man of few words, his hands roughened by time, his eyes carrying a quiet weight that spoke of a life lived deeply, but not loudly. He ordered the same thing every morning: a bowl of oatmeal, 2 eggs, and black coffee. Nothing more. Each day he left a $10 bill, meticulously folded in the same precise way, tucked neatly under his plate like a secret only he and the table shared. Helen McBride, the heart of the diner, never hurried him, never probed, never treated him as though he were just another face passing through. She saw him, truly saw him, in a way that made him more than just the old man in the corner. Then one morning, the familiar jingle of the diner's bell rang, but it wasn't him. Instead, 6 Marines in crisp dress blues stepped inside, their polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum, carrying a folded American flag encased in a polished wooden box. In that moment, Helen understood that the quiet man who had become part of her mornings had left behind something far greater than she could have ever anticipated. Helen McBride was the kind of woman who wore her strength quietly, like a well-worn apron tied around her waist. She wasn't the type to draw attention with loud laughter or bold gestures, but her absence would leave a void in any room she left. Now, in her late 60s, her dark hair was threaded with silver, her posture slightly stooped from years spent on her feet, serving plates and pouring coffee. Yet her voice carried a warmth that could thaw even the iciest Wyoming morning. Every day, just after 5, she unlocked the doors of McBride's Diner, flicked on the flickering fluorescent lights, and slipped into the familiar rhythm that had shaped her life for over 30 years. She and her late husband, Carl, had built the diner from the ground up in the early 1990s, armed with little more than a modest bank loan, a second-hand coffee maker, and a shared vision of a place where people could find comfort in a hot meal and a kind word. Carl, a firefighter with a heart as steady as his hands, had been the kind of man who ran toward danger while others ran away. His sudden heart attack 5 years ago, collapsing mid-stride while mowing their small patch of lawn, had left Helen with a grief too heavy for words and a teenage grandson, Tyler, to raise alone. Tyler, now 17, was the son of Helen's only daughter, who had lost herself to addiction and a tangle of poor choices long ago. By the time Tyler was 8, Helen had become his guardian, his anchor in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of control. He was a good kid, with a kind heart but a restless spirit, still searching for his place in a world that moved too fast for a boy raised among the hum of coffee pots and the clink of silverware. McBride's Diner, with its faded teal booths and creaky linoleum floors, wasn't much to look at anymore. The years had worn it down, much like they had Helen's own body, but it remained a sanctuary for the town's early risers. Truck drivers hauling loads across state lines, mail carriers like Marty who knew everyone's secrets, teachers grading papers over pancakes, and widowers who came not just for the food, but for the quiet nod Helen offered, a gesture that said, "I see you." She didn't just serve coffee, she listened. She remembered birthdays, noticed when someone's usual order changed, or when a wedding band vanished from a finger. Her life wasn't one of grand adventures or glittering moments, but it was rich with small, unspoken acts of care, cracking eggs in the pre-dawn stillness, folding napkins while the radio played softly, pinning faded photographs to the bulletin board by the register. These were the threads that wove her days together. And every morning at exactly 6:30, as the sky softened to a pale gray and the first regulars shuffled through the door, one constant remained, the quiet man in booth 7. It was a frigid Tuesday in late January when Frank Donovan first stepped into McBride's diner. A Wyoming winter howled outside, the kind of cold that bit at your bones and turned the streets into a silent sea of snow. Helen was refilling the sugar caddies, her hands moving with the practiced ease of decades, when she glanced up and saw him. He was tall, his shoulders still broad and squared, as if he'd spent a lifetime standing at attention, though a slight limp favored his right leg. He moved with a deliberate grace, crossing the diner to booth 7 in the far corner, where he settled in as though it had always been his place. Helen approached with her usual smile, the one that put people at ease, and asked, "What can I get started for you?" His eyes, a pale blue that seemed to hold entire stories behind them, met hers. With a voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed, he replied, "Oatmeal, 2 eggs, black coffee." That was it. No small talk, no elaboration. And so began the ritual. Every morning without fail, Frank Donovan arrived at 6:30 a.m. Snow could pile up to the windows, rain could lash the streets, or the wind could scream through the plains. It didn't matter. Booth 7 was his, as much a part of him as the weathered lines etched into his hands. He ate his meal slowly, methodically, savoring each bite as if it were a meditation. When he finished, he'd leave exactly $10, $8.50 for the meal, $1.50 more, the bill folded with crisp precision and tucked beneath his plate. Helen never asked about his past, though she wondered. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, the way his gaze lingered on the window as if searching for something beyond the frost. There was a weight to him, not just in his silence, but in the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen too much but still stood tall. For 3 years, this was their unspoken agreement: a meal, a folded bill, a quiet connection that needed no words. Frank Donovan carried his plate like a guarded secret, holding it close as if it could shield the parts of himself he kept hidden. He wasn't one for small talk or lingering glances. Each morning he'd offer a single nod when Helen set his breakfast before him, and another when he rose to leave, his boots scuffing softly against the diner's worn linoleum. The only words he ever spoke were his order, clipped and precise, as if even that much speech was a concession. Over time, though, Helen began to sense the steady rhythm he brought to her mornings, like the tick of a metronome in a world that spun too fast. In a life full of fleeting faces and constant change, Frank was an anchor, quiet, unshakable, dependable. The other waitresses at McBride's diner saw him differently. Julie, a young server on the afternoon shift, would whisper to her coworkers, her voice low and uneasy, "He gives me the creeps, always watching, never saying a word." Another girl, newer to the crew, would chime in with her own theory, probably a loner, maybe ex-military, or just plain weird. Their hushed speculations swirled like steam from the coffee pots, but Helen never joined in. She didn't gossip, didn't pry into lives that weren't hers to unravel. Instead, each morning as she poured Frank's coffee and slid his plate across the table, she'd say softly, "Glad you're here, Mr. Donovan." He never replied with words, but every so often his nod would linger just a fraction longer, a subtle shift that spoke volumes to Helen. It was enough. She didn't need to know the chapters of his past. She only knew he showed up every day, paid his bill in full, and never caused a ripple of trouble. In her world of aching feet, endless shifts, and private heartaches, Frank's quiet presence became a strange sort of solace. As weeks stretched into months and months into years, Frank Donovan's seat at booth 7 became as much a part of McBride's as the steady tick of the clock above the kitchen door or the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. He was a constant, a fixture Helen came to rely on in her own understated way. She started noticing the small, unchanging details about him. His boots, always the same pair, were worn thin but polished with care, the kind of attention that showed respect without demanding notice. The leather bore creases deep as canyons, hinting at roads traveled and stories unspoken. His hands told a story of their own, large, weathered, with knuckles slightly swollen and veins that stood out like roots under skin. The calluses on his fingertips spoke of hard labor, maybe gripping tools or a rifle, or likely both, Helen thought more than once. Most intriguing was the small, brown, leather-bound journal he kept tucked in the inside pocket of his coat. He never opened it at the table, never scribbled a word while he ate, but he carried it like a talisman, something too sacred to be parted from. Only once did Helen catch him with it, when he thought no one was watching. He'd pulled it out, flipped through a few pages with a tenderness that seemed out of place for his rough hands, then tucked it away with a reverence that felt almost holy. She didn't linger on the moment, didn't let her eyes betray her curiosity. It wasn't her place to ask. Tyler, Helen's grandson, was the only one bold, or perhaps young enough, to try piercing Frank's armor. Working weekend shifts to scrape together gas money, Tyler had a bright, unguarded curiosity that hadn't yet been dulled by the world. One Saturday morning after setting down Frank's usual order, he lingered, his eyes catching on the faded military patch stitched to the left sleeve of Frank's jacket. "You serve, sir?" he asked, his voice warm with genuine interest. Frank froze mid-sip, his coffee cup hovering. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting Tyler's, with a steady, unreadable gaze. He gave a single, firm nod. "No more, no less," he said, his voice low and final. Tyler waited, expecting something more, but when nothing came, he nodded back, respectful, and walked away. From behind the counter, Helen watched the exchange, a faint smile tugging at her lips, not mocking, but with a quiet understanding. Frank had his walls, and his silence, she sensed, was his sanctuary. Then came the storm. It was a brutal February morning, the kind that turned breath to frost and made even the most loyal regulars hesitate before braving the cold. Ice glazed the roads, schools shut their doors, and McBride's diner stood nearly empty. Only two souls showed up that day, Helen because the diner was her life's heartbeat, and Frank Donovan. He arrived at precisely 6:30, snow dusting his shoulders, his coat zipped tight against the chill. His boots crunched over the wet floor as he gave his customary nod and took his place at booth 7. Helen didn't charge him that day. She brought his usual meal, added a warm slice of apple pie still steaming from the oven, and said simply, "On the house, Mr. Donovan." He looked at her, his gaze holding a beat longer than usual, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. Then without a word he ate. When he left, Helen cleared the table. Beneath the napkin, she found nothing, no note, no tip beyond his usual, just the empty plate and the quiet weight of his presence lingering in the air. The morning sun barely crept over the horizon, casting soft hues of lavender and slate across the sleepy town. McBride's diner hummed with the familiar rhythm of dawn, fresh coffee brewing, its rich aroma curling through the air, mingling with the faint scent of buttery toast. Helen, with her steady hands and quiet grace, moved through her morning routine like a well-rehearsed dance. She arranged silverware in neat rows, topped off sugar jars, and ran a damp cloth over the counter, her lips tracing the melody of an old Patsy Cline song, soft and low. At 6:25, her eyes flicked to booth 7 tucked in the corner by the window. Empty. Her heart didn't stir yet. Frank Donovan was as reliable as the sunrise, but even the steadiest souls could stumble a minute or two behind. By 6:30, the diner was awake, but booth 7 remained untouched. Helen brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the gurgle of the machine a small comfort, though her gaze kept drifting to the door. At 6:45, she found herself at the frosted window, peering into the morning mist, half expecting Frank's familiar silhouette to emerge. His worn jacket, his measured stride, the quiet nod that always greeted her. But the sidewalk stayed still, save for the usual faces. Marty, the mailman, with his quick smile, Ron, the Vietnam vet, nursing his black coffee, and a pair of construction workers grabbing to-go cups. No Frank. By 7 a.m., a quiet resolve settled over her. She poured a steaming cup of black coffee, set it carefully at booth 7, and left it there, a silent offering to hope, as if he might still walk in. Saturday passed, then Sunday, with no trace of Frank, no weathered jacket, no steady steps, no nod. The coffee at booth 7 grew cold, untouched. On Monday, Tyler, her grandson, slipped into the diner after school, his sneakers scuffing the linoleum. He found Helen standing before booth 7, her gaze fixed on the empty seat. The table held no plate, no mug, just a neatly rolled napkin cradling silverware, pristine and undisturbed. "You okay, Gran?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. Helen blinked, her lips curving into a smile that faltered at the edges, never reaching her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that wasn't fatigue. It was deeper, a quiet ache that nestled in her chest, like a melody she'd once known but couldn't quite recall. A week dragged by, heavy with absence. On Tuesday morning, before the breakfast rush stirred, Helen approached booth 7 with a cloth in hand, her steps slow, deliberate. She lifted the untouched mug, the fork, the spoon, her fingers lingering on each item as if they held fragments of memory. With careful precision, she wiped the table clean, the cloth moving in slow, almost reverent circles. She didn't speak, didn't share the moment with Tyler or the staff. She simply tucked everything away, the act as final as closing a book. Yet every morning after, her eyes still drifted to the door, a reflex she couldn't shake. Part of her clung to the hope that Frank would stride in, shrug off the chill, and settle into booth 7 as if time hadn't shifted. But another part, quieter and heavier, knew the truth. Something had changed, and booth 7 would never hold the same warmth again. Memorial Day arrived, the sky a brilliant unbroken blue, kissed by a breeze that carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and sun-warmed asphalt. Helen, as always, was the first to unlock McBride's, her key turning in the lock before the town stirred. No rush was expected. Most folks were at parades or sleeping in, but she brewed the coffee anyway, its familiar scent wrapping the diner in comfort. She set a place at booth 7, not out of routine, but out of a stubborn flicker of hope, a quiet wish that refused to fade. At precisely 8:00 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, and the diner fell into a hush. 6 men stepped inside, their marine dress blues crisp and commanding, buttons gleaming like polished stars, shoes reflecting the morning light. The youngest, barely older than Tyler, carried a nervous energy in his posture. The oldest, silver threading his temples, moved with the steady authority of a man who'd seen too much. Conversation stilled. Forks paused in midair. Coffee cups hung frozen halfway to mouths. In a town where a delivery truck was the height of excitement, 6 Marines walking into McBride's was a moment that stole every breath. Helen looked up from behind the counter, her heart catching in her throat, a sudden stutter of fear and knowing. The lead Marine stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady yet softened with respect. "Are you Helen McBride?" She nodded, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the counter's edge. "Yes, I am." He introduced himself as Captain Daniel Hale, his words measured but heavy. "We're here on behalf of Frank Donovan." The name landed like a stone in her chest, sharp and unyielding. From a leather case, Captain Hale produced 3 items with careful reverence. A tightly folded American flag, its edges precise, a polished wooden box, small and solemn, like a keepsake for a sacred memory, and a sealed envelope, her name scrawled across it in bold, slanted cursive. Helen's voice failed her, her hands trembling as she reached out, the weight of the moment settling over her like a shadow that would never lift. "Dear Helen, if you're reading this, I've gone to be with my wife again. My name is Francis Daniel Donovan, but you always called me Mr. Donovan, and I liked it that way." It felt right, like a nod to a time when respect was a given. For 29 years, I served as a Marine Recon Commander. I led men through places so dark they don't bear naming, through moments I've worked hard to leave behind. There are medals, citations, and promotions tucked away in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust, untouched for years. They don't mean much to me now. 15 years ago, I lost my wife, Claire, to cancer. We never had children, though we tried for years. Some dreams, it seems, aren't meant to come true. When she left, the world grew quieter, and so did I. For a time, I thought that was the end of anything that mattered. No family, no community, no one waiting for me on the other side of a door. I wasn't lonely for chatter or crowds. I was lonely for someone to see me, to acknowledge I was still here. That's what you gave me, Helen. You never asked about the limp I carry, never prodded for stories I wasn't ready to tell. You just poured my coffee, set down my eggs, and said, "Glad you're here, Mr. Donovan," every single morning. Those words weren't just kind. They gave me a place in the world again, made me feel like more than an old man fading into the corner booth. I watched you, Helen. You didn't just work. You served with a quiet grace I haven't seen since my days in the Corps. I saw you balance trays of hot coffee while helping a single mother wrangle her toddler. I saw you repeat orders with endless patience for a man whose memory was starting to slip. I saw you slide a slice of pie to a stranger who looked like he needed it more than he could say. No questions asked. You didn't do it for praise or recognition. You didn't broadcast it to the world. You did it because that's who you are. To someone like me, forgotten by most, that meant more than any medal or ceremony ever could. So I've left you a few things. There's a wooden box with my service journal, the real one, not the sanitized version the government keeps. You'll find a purple heart or from an ambush in Kandahar. I took a hit, but 5 of my men walked out alive. That's the part I carry with me. There's a bronze star in there too, and a small photo of you pouring coffee at booth 7. One of my men snapped it. He wanted to know who this woman was that I spoke of like she was family. And there's a fund, not a fortune, but enough to cover a year or 2 of college for your grandson. You mentioned him so often, your pride in him shining through every word. The letter arrived without warning, tucked into the diner's mailbox on a crisp Thursday morning. Tyler, the young waiter with a knack for remembering names, spotted it first, his brow furrowing as he handed it to Helen. The envelope bore no return address, only her name, Mrs. McBride, etched in bold, deliberate block letters. Inside, on plain line paper, was a message that carried the weight of a lifetime. Tyler, right? I haven't forgotten. This might seem sudden, maybe even unearned, but please don't dismiss it. This isn't pity or charity. It's gratitude. You gave an old Marine something no medal, no pension, no parade ever could. Peace. Thank you, Helen McBride, for giving me a place to belong when the world seemed to have forgotten I existed. With respect and profound thanks, Francis D. Donovan, United States Marine Corps, retired. By the time Helen reached the final words, her tears fell quietly, steadily, tracing paths down her cheeks. The letter slipped from her trembling fingers, drifting to the desk. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she clutched the folded flag, Frank's flag, presented by the Marines with solemn reverence, against her chest. Her voice was a whisper, soft as a prayer. You belonged here, Frank. You always did. The next morning, before the first pot of coffee had finished brewing, Helen arrived at the diner with purpose. In her arms were the flag, the letter now framed in simple wood, and a quiet determination that needed no words. Her steps were slower than usual, deliberate, as she moved through the empty restaurant. The sun was just beginning to rise, its golden rays slipping through the blinds, painting the linoleum floor in warm streaks. It was the same light that used to rest on Frank's shoulders as he sat in silence, nursing his coffee. At booth 7, Helen paused. With care, she placed the flag in the center of the table, its folds pristine, a symbol of honor. Beside it, she set the framed note, its words a quiet testament. He sat here every morning. He asked for nothing but kindness. No announcement accompanied her actions. No explanation to the early regulars. None was needed. The diner's rhythm carried on, but something had shifted. Word spread quickly through the small town. It began as murmurs, shared between mail carriers sorting letters, barbers clipping hair, neighbors over fences. Then it grew, amplified by social media posts, local veterans groups, and a single photo Tyler had printed from his phone, now taped in the diner's window. Booth 7, people began to say, was where the Marines sat. Veterans started coming. Some wore their service proudly, patches stitched onto worn jackets. Others bore no visible signs, but Helen knew them by the way they carried themselves. Spines a little straighter, eyes lingering on the flag before glancing at the menu. One man, a Vietnam veteran in a faded denim vest, approached the booth silently. He left a tattered unit patch, carefully folded, beside the flag. He met Helen's gaze with a nod, then stepped back into the morning light without a word. Another left a pair of dog tags, their metal links draped around the napkin holder's base. Some visitors didn't order food or coffee. They simply slid into the booth, pressed their palms against the table, and sat in stillness, heads bowed, eyes closed. before leaving as quietly as they'd come. Tyler began keeping a small notebook beneath the counter for those who wanted to leave messages. Some entries were brief, "Semper Fi, brother." Others were raw, spilling stories of service, loss, and survival, words unspoken for decades. "Thank you for reminding me I'm not invisible," one read. Helen stopped cleaning booth 7. She dusted around it, ensuring the sunlight still fell across the table each morning, just as Frank had liked it. The jukebox, once lively, stayed silent when that corner filled. No music intruded on the quiet reverence that had taken root. Booth 7 became more than a seat in a small-town diner. It was a sanctuary, a place of memory and reflection, not for mourning Frank's death, but for honoring the quiet dignity of his life. It was a testament to how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could have foreseen. People didn't come to snap photos or post online. They came to remember, to feel the weight of a shared history. It had all started with that single envelope, its contents a bridge between past and present. Another letter arrived later, tucked into the same mailbox, its words just as unadorned. "He carried me 3 miles through desert heat after I lost my leg. He never asked for anything." Like the first, it bore no signature, only the weight of a debt repaid in memory. Booth 7, once just a place to sit, had become a quiet tribute, a space where the forgotten found their place again. The explosion from the IED ripped through my leg, a searing blast that left me crumpled in the dirt, blood soaking the ground beneath me. I shouted at him to run, to save himself and leave me behind. He just fixed me with a steady gaze and told me to hush and hold on tight. Said it was no big deal, just a scratch. It was far from that. His refusal to abandon me was what kept me breathing. Helen read those words 3 times, her fingers shaking as she folded the note and tucked it into the small leather journal Frank Donovan had left in her care. She kept it under the counter now, nestled beside the guest book Tyler, her grandson, had started. Letters kept arriving, a steady stream of memories about a man who'd never boasted of his own valor. Some came in crisp envelopes with military postmarks. Others were slipped through the diner's door in the early morning quiet. A few were scrawled in hurried handwriting, others typed neatly and signed with only initials. Yet they all wove a common thread, tales of Frank's unyielding strength, his quiet leadership, his heart that gave without asking for anything in return. One letter came from a man who'd been pinned under rubble in Mosul. He wrote of how the rest of the unit had retreated, but Frank stayed, digging through the debris with his bare hands to pull him to safety. They never spoke of it again, but the man said he saw Frank's face every time he traced the scar on his arm. Another letter spoke of Fallujah, of Frank saving a soldier, someone's brother, without a moment's hesitation. The writer's family had never had the chance to thank him, so those words, etched onto paper, were their attempt to settle that debt. Helen carefully placed each letter in the journal, preserving every word as part of the legacy Frank had unknowingly entrusted to her. What began as a quiet tribute at Booth 7 was growing into something more, something almost sacred, a living testament to a man who'd carried burdens too heavy for most. Tyler, barely 16 and endlessly curious about the man his grandmother spoke of with such quiet reverence, finally sat down with Frank's journal one evening after the diner closed. The neon sign outside was dark, the world beyond the windows still. He expected to find dry accounts of missions, maybe clipped military terms he'd need to look up. Instead, the pages broke his heart wide open. There were entries about sandstorms that raged for days, swallowing the horizon in grit and heat. Notes about young soldiers Frank had led into battle, their names etched in his memory when they didn't return, their families receiving letters he'd written with a trembling hand. He wrote of cold rations, radios that failed when lives hung in the balance, and the crushing weight of choices that could never be undone. Some pages were smeared, ink blurred by water, or perhaps tears. Then there were softer moments, glimpses of a man who'd held on to his humanity. One entry simply read, "Booth 7, she called me Mr. Donovan again today. Looked at me like I was still someone worth knowing." Tyler read in silence, turning each page with care, feeling the weight of Frank's courage settle into him like a stone sinking into still water. It struck him hard. This man, who'd pulled soldiers from fire and ruin, who'd fought wars no one would ever fully grasp, had come home and chosen silence, not out of weakness, but because the world's noise couldn't match the quiet storm he carried within. Frank didn't need to tell his story. He'd lived it. And now, through these letters, through the journal, through the people who returned to Booth 7, not just to remember, but to find healing, his story was being told, one small act of grace at a time. Helen stood in the doorway of McBride's diner one early morning, the world still cloaked in the soft gray before dawn. The parking lot stretched out empty, the first rays of sunlight brushing the edges of the window panes, casting long, gentle shadows across the worn floorboards. She held a cup of black coffee, its warmth seeping into her palms, not for herself, but for Booth 7. It had become her ritual, brewing the first pot before the day began, pouring a single cup, and setting it gently on Frank Donovan's table. In her mind, it wasn't Booth 7 anymore, just Frank's table, a quiet corner where a man's dignity had sat, asking for nothing but a place to rest. As she gazed at the table that morning, her eyes traced the folded flag, the framed note, and the growing collection of mementos left by strangers who'd felt Frank's presence in their lives. She thought about all the years he'd sat just a few feet away, unnoticed in the way that matters most. She'd always been kind, always tried to serve every customer with patience and a smile. But now she wondered how many others like Frank had passed through her diner, carrying stories too heavy to share, wounds too deep to reveal. How many times had she missed the chance to truly see them? Frank had left her more than a flan and a letter. He'd given her a purpose, a quiet calling that settled into her like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling. She thought about how much meaning he'd brought to this small diner, to her life, and to the lives of those who kept his memory alive. One letter, one memory, one cup of coffee at a time. In the hush of those early mornings, when the world felt soft and still, Helen McBride discovered how much it meant to simply be noticed. The realization stirred something deep within her, a quiet resolve that took shape in a small, deliberate act. She printed a modest sign on plain white paper, laminated it with care, and secured it to the wall beside the diner's register. The words were simple but heavy with intent. To all veterans, your coffee is free every morning until 9 o'clock a.m. No questions asked. You've given enough. She didn't make a fuss, didn't broadcast it on social media, or call to the local paper. She just placed the sign there unassuming and waited. They came slowly, one by one, as if drawn by an unspoken invitation. A Navy veteran, hands trembling slightly, a purple heart pinned proudly to his faded ball cap, stepped through the door. A retired Air Force mechanic, a man of few words, would glance at the sign, offer a subtle nod, and settle into his usual seat. A young woman in fatigues, her eyes carrying a weight far beyond her years, would cradle her coffee in the corner, as if it were an anchor keeping her tethered to the present. Some murmured their thanks, their voices soft with gratitude. Others offered only a fleeting smile, their eyes catching the flag draped over Booth 7. Whether they knew the story behind it or not, they seemed to feel its significance, a quiet reverence that hung in the air like the aroma of fresh coffee. Booth 7 remained untouched, a sacred space within the bustle of the diner. No orders were taken there, no plates cleared. Once, Tyler, the young busboy, suggested polishing the table, but Helen stopped him with a gentle shake of her head. "It's perfect as it is," she said, her voice steady but warm. Over time, the booth became a canvas for quiet tributes. Patrons left tokens, a unit pin gleaming in the morning light, a folded note scribbled with gratitude, even a service medal tucked carefully beneath the sugar jar. It wasn't a monument frozen in stone, but a living memorial, carried forward through small, heartfelt gestures that spoke louder than words. For Helen, life continued its familiar rhythm. The grill hissed with sizzling eggs, the coffee maker gurgled as it brewed gallons for the morning rush, and the register chimed with each transaction. Yet something inside her had changed, a subtle shift that felt like a gift. She had learned the power of her own quiet kindness, a simple act she'd never thought twice about until it rippled outward, altering the course of someone's story. Through Frank Donovan's memory, she found purpose in continuing. Each veteran who crossed the diner's threshold, seeking nothing more than a place to sit and feel human again, gave her a reason to keep going. Booth 7 stood empty, yet it brimmed with presence. In a world that often raced past the quiet ones, those who carried their stories in weathered journals, worn boots, or silent glances, Helen had learned a truth. The most remarkable lives often unfolded in the shadows of ordinary days. Frank Donovan hadn't needed fanfare or parades. He'd needed only dignity, a small gesture of respect that acknowledged his existence. That act, so simple yet profound, had sent ripples through the lives of others, echoing long after he was gone. In a time when division seemed to shout louder than unity, Helen's choice to see people, not for their words but for who they were, felt like a quiet rebellion. It was a reminder that every day offered a chance to choose kindness, to notice the veteran at the counter, the neighbor passed without a word, or the stranger sitting quietly in the park. What would it cost to pause and say, "I'm glad you're here"? Booth 7 was just one corner of a small-town diner, but it held a universal truth. Perhaps everyone had their own Booth 7, a place, a person, a moment that changed how they saw the world forever.